This is TWiT.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you have sat through this long enough. You deserve
You're all here for the whiskey, we know.
a fine brown liquor. Oh,
So
look, I have to enter my
curious about
birthday.
We have to talk a little bit about how I select whiskeys for this. And sometimes a listener sends me to one or sends me one. Sometimes I get given to me by a friend. Like there's lots of different things. This was not one of these occasions. This is one of these occasions where on Monday I'm like, what am I going to do? I've been home for a while. What am I going to do? Right. And I literally went to my local whiskey store and I looked on the wall and I was thinking American bourbon because I hadn't done a bourbon in a while. You know, it's not time to go. They did some classics, you know, I'd always check which ones I've already done. What have I missed? I mean, I should do a Willett or any number of that. Evan Williams. And
Pappy Van Winkle.
I already done.
Oh, you did Pappy. Yep. That's right.
Yeah. Not that I can find that on a shelf anywhere. And then I also had a hankering for, I've only done a couple of Japanese. Maybe I should do Japanese.
Whistle Pig. Have you done Whistle Pig?
I saw this, and turns out it's both. It's American and Japanese.
Oh, yeah, combined.
That's what I was wondering. So this is a partnership.
What the heck? Yeah, well, it's by partnership, I mean an ownership, right? Like to be clear.
Yes. Well, in the Microsoft sense of partnership.
Yeah. You would partner now. What's interesting about this is that it is a collab, Jim Beam, yes, owned by Suntory, but it is a collaboration between Jim Beam and Suntory. Now, obviously, I'll do a quick run down on the two companies. Suntory, we've talked about a number of times now from the original Japanese whiskey show way back when. This is Shinjiro Tori, who first started selling imported wine in 1899, and then there's Masaka Takasuru, who was the serious whiskey guy who had been trained in Scotland, and so they collaborated, built the first Scottish style whiskey distillery in Japan, the Yamazaki distillery in 1923. Took him a few years to make a whiskey. It was terrible. Takasuru, went back to Scotland, did everything he could to try and make it better. Finally got frustrated with Tori and left in 1934, went and made his own distillery, the Nikkei distillery, which is up in Hokkaido, the northern part, because it was more like Scotland. Meantime, Shinjiro Tori continued on. In 1937, he finally got a hit with his Suntory whiskey, which the Japanese soldiers really liked. Fast forward over the good years and bad years of whiskey. And of course, we all hear about Suntory with 2003 when Lost in Translation comes out, right? Make it Suntory time. And also the same year that the Yamazaki 12 was the very first Japanese whiskey to ever win an international contest. They got the gold medal. That transformed Suntory. I've never really dug into this part because by 2009, Suntory is now reorganized into this monster multi-entity. There's a holding company, the beverage and food company. There's a thing called Products Limited. There's wellness. There's liquors. There's beer and spirits. There's the Wine International Group. And they start buying entities, lots of different companies, to the point that by the time they acquire Beam in 2014, they're the third largest producer of distilled beverages after Diageo and Pernod Ricard. Now, if you go to the Beam story, which I've never talked about before, because we generally don't talk about Beam whiskeys, for better or worse, and there's a ton of them, today, besides Jim Beam, that's also Basil Hayden and Knob Creek and Booker's and Baker's and Little Book and Old Tub and Old Crow and Old Granddad and Old Overholt, whatever that is, and Hardin Creek. Like they own a lot of whiskeys, some of them which they made and some of them which they acquired. The company goes all the way back to a man named James Beam selling whiskey in 1795. The company is officially called the James Beam Distilling Company in 1935, although they ultimately sell it to a guy named Harry Blum, who's a spirit merchant out of Chicago. And then it becomes that horrible story about products where it just shifts from one brand company to another all through the 60s and 70s. One of them was American Brands, which was originally a tobacco company, but it was also in insurance and golf and home hardware. And while they're under that banner, in 85, American Brands bought National Distillers, which is where Old Crow comes from, and they become the Jim Beam Brands company. So they're now going down that horrible path as well, until the parent company, American Brands, becomes Fortune Brands, because that's not weird or creepy at all, and buys 20 more whiskey-related brands from Allied Dominique in 2005. And this is when they ended up with many Scottish distilleries and others as well. And so by that point, it's now called Beam Global Spirits and Wine. It's 2006, which they actually split off from Fortune Brands to become a separately publicly traded company, because I guess they decided they needed more money. But at the moment they were public, they were a candidate for acquisition. And by 2014, that's Suntory. So Suntory ends up owning it and renames Suntory to Beam Suntory, largely because they were concerned that Suntory was not well known in the US market, but Jim Beam is. And so the name was really important. So they thought. They don't think that anymore. As of May of this year, this parent company is now called Suntory Global Spirits. So there's the origin of the two companies that collaborate over this whiskey, even though they've basically been the same company for 10 plus years. But, Suntory being one of the good guys, I think, like Diageo, where they've really done a lot of work to protect brands and arguably enhance those brands. Suntory is also the guys who facilitated Maker's Mark making their cellar editions, some very good whiskey they wouldn't have been able to make without the money available to them that Suntory has to be able to expand, which otherwise was a very small operation. So the actual collaboration part of this whiskey is between two people, Fred Noe and Shinji Fukuyo. So Fred Noe is a 7th generation master distiller. He is literally the great grandson of Jim Beam. So this is the family heritage of Jim Beam, which is still involved. And the core of this whiskey is a Jim Beam mash bill. So 76% corn, 12% rye, 10% barley. And then it goes into American oak for 5 years, which is super normal. That, to me, is an American bourbon, right? Except it's not. Because after that, they take a portion of the batch and they put it into Californian red wine oak casks for about a year. And another portion goes into sherry casks for a couple of years. And then the separate, what they call parcels, these products, are blended by Shinji. So Fred Noe is responsible for making the bourbon and setting up the barrelings. And then all of those parcels of the product in different barrels goes over to Shinji, who is only the 5th ever blender for Suntory. And remember, the Suntory made their money on blended whiskey. Their single malts are an anomaly, but their famous yellow label Suntory whiskey, it's always been a blend. Their blends have always been their business. The challenge here is that Japanese whiskey has always been made in the Scottish style. They only work in barley. So for Shinji, this is kind of a shock. Here you have this mash bill concept as well as this array of barrels. So he's trying to assemble different flavors together and does this unique blending. And they did the first version of this back in 2019. So it's been around a few years. I just finally ran into it. The crazy part is, what do you even call this? Because it breaks the rules for American bourbon and it breaks the rules for Japanese whiskey. Nominally, it is an American blended whiskey, but that has a very bad reputation. Like, generally speaking, blended whiskeys are frowned on in the American market. They don't mind buying a Scottish blended whiskey like a Chivas or a Famous Grouse, and they certainly don't mind buying Japanese whiskeys that way. But when it comes to American, that's kind of a problem. Although I would point out that Jim Beam makes a blended whiskey too called Little Book. And coincidentally, the master distiller in charge of Little Book is Fred Noe's son, Freddie. So all in the family. On the other hand, the other part about this is, okay, so I like a blend because somebody did this intentionally. They put the pieces together. They were looking for a flavor profile. Shinji goes into the idea of like the fruitiness. I find too sweet when it's just bourbon, too much caramel. I want a little more fruit. I want a little more tannins. And so he gets that from the wine and from the sherry. But the other part is they don't do chill filtration and they don't do coloring. So one of the complaints from some of the reviewers is that depending on the bottle of this you buy, different colors, different shades, because not every barrel behaves the same way. And they're not trying to compensate for that. They're focused on a consistent flavor and they get it. Well, as far as I know, I've only had one bottle of this so far. So up front of the nose, this is only 47%. So not a lot of burn, but it's not pathetic either. Like, you definitely know there's alcohol in there. It's got that burnt caramel, butterscotch kind of, I think I'm drinking bourbon. Like, here it comes. And then a weird fruit note hits you. Like, that's not what happens with bourbon normally. This is much more like a ported scotch. Like that's strange. But then it's got a sort of tightness coming off your mouth after that. More of the leather and the smoky. Not that there's any peat in this, and lots of warming. So good evening drink, although I'm drinking in the afternoon, but I drink in the afternoon every Wednesday. What's brilliant about it? $44 from Total Wine. You know, because it's not a single malt, because they're not being pretentious about it. What they did was they made the best whiskey they could using a different set of skills and a sort of typical production. So it's reasonably priced for an unusual whiskey, without being awful, right? When we talked about JD, I'm impressed with how good JD is for a $20 bottle of wine. But
I'm looking for a whiskey that's not awful. That seems like
I care less, honestly.
Yeah. But
about awfulness or about leather off your mouth?
About awfulness.
But you know, a couple of the themes that have come out with doing this on a routine basis is like I'm learning not to hate the conglomerates because they seem to be doing good things.
Yeah,
and I'm learning to resist the. Not that I've ever. People consider me pretentious about whiskey just because I'm knowledgeable. Although whenever I ask me what my favorite is, it's like the one sitting in front of me. I'm not that idealistic. I
like that. That's a good motto.
Yeah. I got a little Glengarrick in the decanter behind me, and it's still fantastic. We talked about it a while ago, and I put it in the decanter. Yeah. This is a big, rich, jammy. It's a surprise. You don't expect this much from a $44 bottle of American bourbon that even can't be called American bourbon. Even though it says on the label here, Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, partially finished in wine and sherry cask. So they're being honest, but not according to the FDA rules, it's not really a bourbon, right?
Right.
So they've definitely tinkered with it, but they've tinkered with it in a lovely way.
Legent with a T at the end.
Apparently it's Legent.
Legent.
I had to look it up.
Names are Legent.
Mm. Yes.
Well, once again, I'm at work and I'm drinking.
It must be Wednesday.
That's a good job.
It
must be Wednesday.
Sometimes that becomes my whole afternoon.
That's Richard Campbell. He is runasradio.com and .net Rocks. Also runasradio.com. Always a pleasure. Our whiskey expert, an aficionado, but not snob. And I like that.